The modern atheistic community has come up with lots of accusations against the God of the Bible. One of those is that God is pro-slavery. They suggest to us that because the writers of the Bible portrayed God as a being that does not condemn all forms of human servitude or slavery, then that God cannot be the perfect moral being that Christians say He is. Let's read a few statements by atheists who make this accusation. Sam Harris, in his letter to a Christian nation, said, "Consider the question of slavery. The entire civilized world now agrees that slavery is an abomination. What moral instruction do we get from the God of Abraham on this subject? Consult the Bible and you will discover that the Creator of the universe clearly expects us to keep slaves. Nothing in Christian theology remedies the appalling deficiencies of the Bible on what is perhaps the greatest and the easiest moral question our society has ever had to face." You see, what Sam Harris is saying is, every single person in the world understands, if they're thinking morally, that any type of human servitude or slavery is wrong. If it's the easiest moral question that there is to answer, and the Bible presents a being that does not condemn all human servitude or all forms of what someone might consider to be slavery, then obviously the Bible and the God of the Bible and the writers of the Bible, they couldn't be the perfect moral examples that Christians are saying that they are. Listen to this statement by Dan Barker. Barker said, "Why did Jesus, the unrivaled moral example, never once speak out against slavery? Why did the loving, wise Son of God forget to mention that human bondage is a brutal institution? Why did He incorporate it into His teachings as if it were the most natural thing in the world? I'll tell you why. Because He supported it. The Old Testament endorses and encourages slavery, and Jesus, being equal to God, supposedly wrote the old laws, so He had to support slavery." You see there, the accusation again is that the Bible writers presenting Jesus and presenting God as beings who would condone slavery, beings who would not condemn all forms of human servitude, they simply cannot be, according to the atheistic viewpoint, moral beings. And so people who are in the atheistic community look at the Bible and say, this is a deficiency. This is a problem that the Bible has. Is it true that the idea of human servitude or the slavery that's depicted and pictured in the Bible militates against the idea that God is a perfectly moral God? No, it's not. And we're going to get into why that's the case, but the first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, where would the atheistic community get a foundation upon which to say something is objectively right or something is objectively wrong? What I mean by that is, if the atheist says this is immoral, this is wrong, the simple question would be, according to whom? When you look for a foundation for an ethic, for morals in the atheistic philosophy, what you quickly realize is that there's not one. You cannot go to atheism and find a way that you could ever say this is objectively, morally right. William Provine illustrated that for us so very well in his speech in 1998 on the campus of the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, Tennessee. He said this in his Darwin Day speech. He said, "Naturalistic evolution has clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly. No gods worth having exist. No life after death exists. No ultimate foundation for ethics exists. No ultimate meaning in life exists, and human free will is non-existent." If we were to look there at the third point that Provine made, no foundation for ethics exists. And he says Charles Darwin understood this perfectly. When you look to Charles Darwin's writings, you see that yes, he did understand this perfectly. Listen to what Charles Darwin said about a person who doesn't believe in God. He said, "A man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or of a future existence with retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones. What was Charles Darwin saying? If a person does not believe in God, if a person doesn't think that there is a final reward, if there is final retribution, then the best that person can do is follow the instincts and impulses which seem best to him. If you were to look in Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, you would see a very, I don't know if you would say surprising if you understand what the atheistic philosophy really is, but a very eye-opening statement. Let me read to you a statement he made in that book. Richard Dawkins said, "We are survival machines, robot vehicles, blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. Much as we might wish to believe otherwise, universal love and the welfare of the species as a whole are concepts that simply do not make evolutionary sense." Do you understand what Dawkins is saying? The entire point of human existence is for this robotic machinery to pass on molecules called genes. And as much as we would like to think that love and human welfare are things that are part of this robotic machinery, Dawkins says they're not. That love and universal welfare of the human species is not something you get from atheistic philosophy. Now, if we were to say, hey, does the Bible condemn or condone slavery? If the atheistic community says, well, if it does condemn slavery, then that's right. If it does not condemn slavery, then that's wrong. The simple question is, according to whom? And the answer there is, atheism cannot give us an objective right and wrong. In fact, if you were to look at the naturalistic world around us, what we would see is that in some cases, there are organisms that use slavery to their advantage, and it helps them pass on their genetic material. Amazonian slave-making ants. They're prosperous, they do well in passing on their genes. How do they do that? They find an ant colony that is not of their particular kind, and they go and they steal the babies from that ant colony. They bring them over to their colony, and they raise them and force them to be slaves and to do their work. In fact, studies have been done on Amazonian slave-making ants, and if you take the slaves away from them, they cannot prosper, and they die, and they can't pass on their genetic information. So, according to Dawkins, if we humans are robotic machines programmed to pass on our genes, if slavery would help us pass on our genes, then what would make that wrong? Now, in The Selfish Gene, the book he wrote, he tried to argue that we need to rise above this, we need to do differently than our ancestors did or than other organisms do. But why? He can't give you a why. The atheistic philosophy can't give you a why. There's no way, according to atheism, that you can say it is objectively, morally wrong to have a person be your servant. So, if we were just to start this discussion and listen to the allegation by the atheistic community that the God of the Bible condones slavery and that makes him immoral, the simple way to answer that from the outset is you cannot ask or answer a question like that according to atheism because you don't have an objective moral standard. But there's something else I want you to see that's getting done in this discussion. It's something called the spotlight fallacy. And the spotlight fallacy is when a certain case that has received lots of media attention is presented as the example of all cases in that particular category. Now let's think about that as it relates to slavery. If I were to ask you, what form of slavery has received the most attention? What form has been in the spotlight the most? Well, of course, you know the answer to that would be colonial slavery there, the slavery that was going on in the 1800s in the colonies in the Americas. And if I were to ask you what were some facets of that type of slavery, many of us who have seen the television programs and have seen the media coverage of what was going on then, understand that that was in many cases a very abusive, harsh, inhumane treatment of other humans. We understand that. Many of those people were kidnapped from their homes for no reason. They were enslaved because of their race. It had nothing whatsoever to do with anything wrong that they had done. They were tortured and killed on a regular basis if they didn't do exactly what the masters wanted. And that type of slavery is presented as the example of all human servitude or slavery, and that then is used to say, well, if God condones any slavery, then it must be slavery that's similar to that, and so the God of the Bible is immoral. Well, there are several reasons why that is not the case. When we look at the biblical picture of slavery, of human servitude, what we need to understand first is that slavery and human servitude was never in God's plan from the beginning. What I mean is, it's a less than ideal situation. You say, okay, Kyle, less than ideal, what are you trying to say there? When Adam and Eve were created, the world was perfect, there was no sin. But after they sinned and they were ejected from the Garden of Eden, there were going to be some things that were imperfect that God was going to have to regulate. One of those things was going to be, what happens when people do things that are wrong? What happens when there is criminal activity? What happens when a person accrues so much debt that they can't pay it back? Do you think that God ever wanted a person to go to prison? No, certainly He didn't. In fact, God from the very beginning wished that all people would choose to do right, but all people weren't going to choose to do right. So if you are going to have some people who choose wrongly, and let's say they commit criminal acts, what are you going to do with those people? Well, if you're God and you see that certain relationships could become abusive, then you're going to have to put regulations on those relationships so they don't become abusive. So what we see in the Old Testament, often and even in the New, is that sometimes God regulated things that were less than ideal. Is prison less than ideal? Certainly. But is it morally inherently wrong? Absolutely not. But could it become abusive if not regulated? Yes, it could. So what we're seeing in the Old Testament is that human servitude was not an ideal situation. But because it was going to happen due to the wrong choices of people, God needed to regulate that. And what you see when you look into the Bible is that the idea of human servitude or slavery, as some people would call it, was nothing like what was going on in the colonial Americas. There were some very serious differences that separate it from what was going on then. Let's look at some of those differences. Number one, it was never based on race or ethnicity. I want you to read with me Leviticus 19:34. But the stranger who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Notice that there in Leviticus, you see the statement is made that God has no view of race or ethnicity insofar as how a person is to be treated. He tells the Israelites, you need to treat all of the strangers, all people who aren't Israelites, in the same way as you would treat each other. They are humans, you are humans, I made you both, and there's no race dividing line by which we would say that this group needs to be in service to another group, because you are created all in the image of God, and race is not a determining factor as to who should serve who. If you were to look in other verses, you see the exact same thing. If you were to read Deuteronomy 24:14, you would read, you shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether one of your brethren or one of the aliens who is in your land within your gates. There again, you see the exact same point, that servitude or slavery was never based on race or ethnicity. Read with me Deuteronomy 10:17 through 19. For the Lord your God is God of gods, and the Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality, nor takes a bribe. He administers justice for the fatherless and widow, and loves the stranger, giving him food and clothing. therefore love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Love the stranger? Well, that's not the picture that is presented to us often in the accusations made against the God of the Bible. In fact, often we are led to believe that God was an ethnocentric God who favored the Israelites and who abused and tortured and enslaved every person that wasn't an Israelite. But that's not the picture you get from the Bible when you honestly read what it has to say. You see, the servitude and the slavery that was allowed in the Bible was never condoned based on race or ethnicity. God said that the children of Israel were to be kind to the strangers, exactly like they were to be kind to their brethren. You know what's ironic in this case? The accusation is made that the God of the Bible is racist, at least it's implied that God is. But the Darwinian theory actually does promote racism. I want you to listen to what Charles Darwin said about this concept of racism. Charles Darwin said in The Descent of Man, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffenhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope even than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla." Do you see, there is some racism that's going on here, but it's not from the Bible or the God of the Bible. The racism that's going on here is if you were to understand that a genetic connection between lower apes would mean that certain groups were not as complex as other groups, certain races of men were inferior to other superior races, you can understand Darwin's statement there. What he was saying is Caucasians happen to be the highest level of human race. And the lower savage races, which he said himself, savage races, well, those savage races like the Negro and the Australian, do you understand that? Darwin was a racist in that he believed that there were certain higher elevated races of humans and lower savage races. And that simply is not the case. In fact, that's never what you get from the Bible. When you look into the Bible, you see that God created all men and women in His image, and no person or group of people are disparaged because of a certain race or because of a certain ethnicity. That's something very different from colonial slavery that we see. There's something else that's very different from colonial slavery. If you were to go to the Bible and you were to analyze these differences, you would see that it was never all right to kidnap a person and force that person into slavery. Let me read to you a couple passages along those lines. If you were to read Exodus 21:16, the Bible says, "He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death." Kidnapping was wrong. It was a criminal action, and anyone who kidnapped another person and that was found out, that person who did the kidnapping was killed. If you went to 1 Timothy chapter 1, you would read this in verses 8 through 10. "We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for the lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, for kidnappers," or that word is men stealers or slave traders. There again, you see something very different than what was going on in colonial slavery. You see that the Bible specifically says if there is a person that kidnaps another person and you find that out, then the kidnapper is a criminal and that kidnapper is going to suffer the consequences of his criminal action. You see, that picture of colonial slavery that we're led to believe exemplifies all forms of human servitude, well, that's not right at all. And you see that the Bible never has God condoning kidnapping and other crimes against humanity that would not be in congruence with morality. There's another thing that is very different from the Old Testament regulations of human servitude and the colonial slavery that we're often told is the example of this particular case. The thing that's very different is that if a slave ran away, that slave was not to be returned. If that slave was being abused and wanted out of the service relationship that he had with the master, if he ran away, he was not, according to the Bible, to be returned to his master. Let's read the passage that tells us that. Over in Deuteronomy 23:15 through 16, we read, "You shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you. He may dwell with you in your midst, in the place where he chooses, within one of your gates, where it seems best to him. You shall not oppress him." There you have it. Several of the differences between what was going on in colonial America, slavery, and the biblical form of human servitude. You might then take a step back and say, well, why is slavery in the Bible at all? That just doesn't make sense. Even though it might not be like American colonial slavery, surely any type of human servitude is wrong. Is it? That's the question that we would have to answer, and we'd have to answer that yes. We'd have to answer it in the affirmative to see if God was a moral or immoral being. If you could show that every single type of human servitude was immoral, and God allowed or condoned that kind of thing, or He regulated it and didn't stop it or didn't say it was wrong, if you could show that, well then you might have a case. But you can't show that. There's a reason you can't show that, because all forms of human servitude are not inherently morally wrong. Now they can be abused, just like any relationship could be abused. Just like a parent-child relationship could be abused. Just like a boss-employee relationship or a governmental official and a non-governmental person could be abused. Sure, they could be abused. But inherently are forms of human servitude, all of them morally wrong? No. You have to answer absolutely positively not. Because we, even in America, recognize that there are some forms of human servitude or restricting people's freedoms that are morally justified. Give me one of those. Easy to understand. Suppose a person goes in, takes a 9mm pistol, robs a bank, shoots the teller, is apprehended by the police, is taken to trial, and he is found guilty, and he is sentenced to life in prison. Are you going to curtail the freedoms of that individual because of something that he's done? Sure you are. For the rest of his life, he is going to be, in essence, in a very real sense, a slave of the state. Can you say that that's a morally apprehensible position? You can't say that. Why? Because he committed a crime that is worthy of putting him in some type of servitude. Let's look at the Bible and see how that idea applies to what's going on as the regulations are applied to slavery. If you were to go to Leviticus chapter 18, verses 21 through 24, you would read this. "And you shall not let any of your descendants pass through the fire to Molech. Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you." What did it mean to let your children pass through the fire to Molech? That meant that some of the people in the land of Canaan were literally taking their children and putting them on a idol that was burning, that was scorching, and they were burning their children as sacrifices to the god Molech. Now, if you go into the land of Israel and God has appointed the Israelites as His arm of justice, would it be morally permissible to cause people who have killed their children to be put into service to another group of people, in essence to a government that has the oversight of those criminals? Inherently, you couldn't say that that would be a morally wrong position. Let me read to you another statement from Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 4. Do not think in your heart after the Lord your God has cast them out before you, saying, because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me in to possess this land, but it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Why did God say He was driving out the other nations? Because of their wickedness. In fact, many of those people in the other nations were put into human servitude or slavery because of the criminal actions that they had committed. Now, if that is true, what would we expect from God if the Israelites then started doing the exact same thing that the people in the nations around them were doing? If God is no respecter of persons, if slavery or human servitude is not based on ethnicity or race, if the Israelites started allowing their children to pass through the fire to Molech, if they started committing criminal actions, what would you expect God to do? Well, you'd expect God to put them over into a form of servitude or slavery, just like He allowed the other nations to be put into. Do you know that's exactly what you see happening when you go to the book of Jeremiah? In Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 35, we read, and they built high places of Baal which are in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire to Molech, which I did not command them, nor did it come into my mind that they should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin. And if you'll go down just a few verses there after verse 35, you read that God sold the Israelites into bondage and sent them into the land of Babylon. And there you see exactly why God permitted much of the bondage that was going on in the Old and New Testaments, because people had committed crimes. Let me give you an even more clear verse along those lines. If you were to go to the book of Exodus and you were to read chapter 22, verses 1 through 3, if a man steals an ox or a sheep, he should make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. Now that is easy to understand. If a person goes out and steals something, they use that for their own benefit, it is found out that they have stolen that, they are found guilty, they need to make restitution for what they have stolen. If they can't do that, then what was permissible in that case? What was permissible is for them to be put into a form of service, a form of human servitude or slavery, so that they would have to work off what they had stolen. Is that a morally permissible situation? Yes, it is. There is nothing immoral about that. See, what the atheist would have to do is show that God not only allowed but condoned and approved of abusive human relationships. And what you see when you look through the Bible and closely analyze this idea of human service or servitude or slavery is that there is never a time where God approves of an abusive human relationship. In fact, what we often see in the Bible is that the human service that is discussed as slavery or servitude is actually a mutually beneficial relationship. This mutually beneficial relationship can be seen in how many of the masters and servants acted toward each other. Let me read to you a statement from Leviticus chapter 25, verses 47 through 49. Now, if a sojourner or stranger close to you becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner close to you, one of his brothers may redeem him. You see, what's going on in that situation is a person who is poor sells himself, sells his service to another person who is very rich. Now, that doesn't mean he forfeits his rights as a human, and that doesn't mean that God ever approved of inhumane treatment. All it means is that God allowed that form of servitude, and many times that form of servitude became a mutually beneficial situation that we would see much more as an employee-employer relationship than a master-slave type relationship. Let me show you some passages that bear that out. If you were to go to Deuteronomy 15, 16 through 17, you would read, and if it happens that he, a slave, says to you, I will not go away from you, because he loves you and your house, since he prospers with you. then you shall take an awl and thrust it through his ear to the door. And he shall be your servant forever. Also to your maidservant you shall do likewise. You see, this is a passage that shows us that often the relationship was a mutually beneficial relationship. A relationship that the servant wanted to stay in and did not want to get out of. You see, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, the word that is translated for servant is the same word translated for slave. Ebed in the Old Testament and doulos in the New Testament. And many times, if you're looking at this situation, you see a relationship much more of a servant-type relationship than a slave relationship. Now, what the skeptic would like to do is make a blanket statement that if that word is ever used, it means a slave, and that slavery always corresponds to colonial slavery with inhumane treatment, and that's why the God of the Bible is immoral. But you can't do that. What you'd have to show is that God approves of abusive human relationships, and He does not. He never has. In fact, the book of Job gives us a very clear idea as to how righteous, good people understood God's regulations of servitude. Job says this, "If I have despised the cause of my male or female servant when they complained against me, what then shall I do when God rises up, when He punishes? How shall I answer Him? Did not He who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb?" You see Job's understanding of how people are to be treated. Job says that if I have a servant or a slave, and that slave complains about how I'm treating him or her, if I don't look at that situation fairly, if I abuse that person, then God is going to call me into judgment for that. Why? Because I was created in the womb exactly like that servant was created, and God views all humans as equal, and He never approves of inhumane or abusive situations. And the skeptic says, what do you mean God never approves of inhumane or abusive situations? There are passages in the Bible that talk about beating. Yes, there are. Let me read to you one. In Exodus chapter 21, verse 26 through 27, "If a man strikes the eye of his servant or the eye of his maidservant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out his servant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth." You see, the skeptic comes to the Bible and sees passages about beating and says, any time that another person is allowed to beat another person, that is immoral, it's always wrong, there's no possible way you can make that right. Well, hold on just a second. If we can, in the United States of America, condemn someone to life in prison because of a criminal action that he or she has committed, would it or could it be a morally permissible situation to cause a person to be physically beaten because of a crime that they committed? Now, this discussion would then need to change to, well, it's always wrong to use physical beating to punish a crime, and then you would go into a discussion on that, and we could show that, no, that's not true. It would be moral and permissible for someone to be beaten. But here's the rub in this situation. God never said it's all right to beat a slave, but it's not all right to beat someone who was free. That statement is not made, and those beating passages are not made and apply only to slaves. They apply to any person who was worthy of receiving that kind of punishment. Let me read to you another passage, not very far from the one we just read. It's found in Deuteronomy 25, 2 through 3. "If the wicked man deserves to be beaten, the judge will cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence according to his guilt with a certain number of blows." You see, it's not that the Bible's saying you could beat a slave but you couldn't beat another person. The Bible is saying that if there's a person who's committed some type of criminal activity that's worthy of beating, even if he is a slave, then that slave can be beaten. But even if he's a free person, then that free person can be beaten. If they deserve the punishment, then they get the punishment whether they're a slave or whether they're free. When you go to the next allegation against the God of the Bible and against Jesus, it's the idea that, okay, well, maybe God didn't approve of all of the slavery type relationships that you see in the New Testament and Old Testament. Maybe He didn't approve of abusive relationships, but He didn't ever condemn them. If you were to listen to Dan Barker, he says, why did Jesus, the unrivaled moral example, never once speak out against slavery? Where does he get that idea? Well, you go to passages in the New Testament and sometimes in the epistles where Paul would write about slaves and masters and their relationships. You would read like in 1 Peter 2:18, servants be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. Ephesians 6:5, servants be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ. You see, those passages don't specifically, explicitly condemn slavery and abusive relationships. And the skeptic says, well, if they don't condemn abusive relationships every time those relationships are mentioned, then that means they condone them. No, that's not what it means at all. In fact, if you use that line of reasoning and you were to go to the book of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus made statements that would show that line of reasoning to be absolutely, positively false. If you were to go to Matthew chapter 5, verse 39, you would read, but I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. Now, does Jesus condemn the abuse of the evil person in this particular verse? No, he doesn't. Well, does that mean he's approving of a person slapping another person on the cheek? No, that's not what it means. What does it mean? It means that there are going to be some human relationships that are abusive. How would and should a Christian respond to an abusive human relationship? If someone slaps you on the right cheek, Jesus says, turn the other to him also. There in that same chapter, you read another passage that shows us what's going on here. There in Matthew chapter 5, verses 44 and 45, especially 44, but I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. God doesn't condemn in that particular instance those who are persecuting the Christians. Does that mean he approves of those? No, that's not what it means. It means that if you find yourself in an abusive relationship, he gives you the way that you should behave to show the people who are abusing you the love of Christ. What the skeptic would have to do in order to show that the biblical position on slavery and human servitude is immoral is they'd have to show where God approves of an abusive relationship. And they can't do that because God never approves of abusive relationships. In fact, if you were to try to find a way to abolish slavery, there's only one way you could do it. Do you know how you could abolish slavery? If everybody in the world would apply to their life the golden rule that Jesus laid down in Matthew 7:12. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. If every person in this world did to other people what they wanted other people to do to them, do you think slavery would have ever occurred? Do you think there ever would be servitude that would be abusive or harsh, the kind of servitude like was going on in the colonial Americas? No. The atheistic community would like to tell you that they have a higher morality, but they can't answer moral questions. They certainly can't tell you how if we are just genetic robots trying to pass on our genes, then it would ever be wrong to have slaves and force them to do what you want. But when you go to the Bible, you see that God created all humans equally, made the person who finds himself in a service relationship in the womb exactly like the person who finds himself in a relationship of authority. God never approved of abusive relationships, but if we were to apply the golden rule, do unto others as you want them to do to you, we would quickly see that all abusive relationships would cease, and that New Testament Christianity is the only way to abolish the abusive, wrong, immoral, inhumane types of slavery that have been permitted and allowed throughout the course of human history.
This has been a presentation of Apologetics Press, an organization dedicated to the defense of New Testament Christianity. Visit us on the web at apologeticspress.org or call 800-234-8558.